Welcome back. And now, The Gunslinger Dark Tower Series, Book 1 by Stephen King. Part 10, narrated by The Laughing Ogre. "Look," Jake said, pointing upward. The gunslinger looked up and felt an obscure joint in his back pop. They had been in the foothills for 2 days now, and although the water skins were almost empty again, it didn't matter now. There would soon be all the water they could drink. He followed the vector of Jake's finger upward, past the rise of the green plain to the naked and flashing cliffs and gorges above it, and on up toward the snow cap itself. Faint and far, nothing but a tiny dot. It might have been one of those motes that dance perpetually in front of the eyes, except for its consistency. The gunslinger beheld the man in black, moving up the slopes with deadly progress, a minuscule fly on a huge granite wall. "Is that him?" Jake asked. The gunslinger looked at the depersonalized mote doing its faraway acrobats, feeling nothing but a premonition of sorrow. "That's him, Jake." "Do you think we'll catch him?" "Not on this side. On the other. And not if we stand here talking about it." "They're so high," Jake said. "What's on the other side?" "I don't know," the gunslinger said. "I don't think anybody does. Maybe they did once. Come on, boy." They began to move upward again, sending small runnules of pebbles and sand down toward the desert that washed away behind them in a flat bake sheet that seemed never to end. Above them, far above, the man in black moved up and up and up. It was impossible to see if he looked back. He seemed to leap across impossible gulfs, to scale sheer faces. Once or twice he disappeared, but always they saw him again, until the violet curtain of dusk shut him out of their view. When they made their camp for the evening, the boy spoke little, and the gunslinger wondered if the boy knew what he'd already intuited. He thought of Cuthbert's face, hot, dismayed, excited. He thought of the crumbs. He thought of the birds. "The end's this way," he thought. "Again and again it ends this way. There are quests and roads that lead ever onward, and all of them end up in the same place, upon the killing ground. Except, perhaps, the road to the tower." The boy, the sacrifice, his face innocent and very young in the light of their tiny fire, had fallen asleep over his beans. The gunslinger covered him with the horse blanket and then curled up to sleep himself. The Oracle in the Mountains. The boy found the Oracle, and it almost destroyed him. Some thin instinct brought the gunslinger up from sleep to the velvet darkness which had fallen on them at dusk like a shroud of well water. That had been when he and Jake reached the grassy, nearly level oasis above the first rise of tumbled foothills. Even on the hard scrabble below, where they had toiled and fought for every foot in the killer sun, they had been able to hear the sound of crickets rubbing their legs seductively together in the perpetual green of willow groves above them. The gunslinger remained calm in his mind, and the boy had kept up at least the pretense of a facade, and that had made the gunslinger proud. But Jake hadn't been able to hide the wildness in his eyes, which were white and starry, the eyes of a horse scenting water and held back from bolting only by the tenuous chain of its master's mind. Like a horse at the point where only understanding, not the spur, could hold it steady. The gunslinger could gauge the need in Jake by the madness the sounds of the crickets bred in his own body. His arms seemed to seek out shale to scrape on, and his knees seemed to beg to be ripped in tiny, maddening, salty gashes. The sun trampled down on them all the way, even when it turned a swollen, feverish red with sunset. It shone pervasively through the knife cut in the hills off to their left, blinding them and making every teardrop of sweat into a prism of pain. Then there was grass. At first only yellow scrub clinging to the bleak soil where the last of the runoff reached with gruesome vitality. Further up, there was witchgrass, sparse, then green and rank. Then the first sweet smell of real grass mixed with the timothy and shaded by the first of the dwarfed firs. There the gunslinger saw an arc of brown movements in the shadows. He drew, fired, and felled the rabbit all before Jake could begin to cry out his surprise. A moment later, he had reholstered the gun. "Here," the gunslinger said. Up ahead, the grass deepened into a jungle of green willows that was shocking after the parched sterility of the endless hardpan. There would be a spring, perhaps several of them, and it would be even cooler, but it was better out here in the open. The boy had pushed every step he could push, and there might be sucker bats in the deeper shadows of the grove. The bats might break the boy's sleep, no matter how deep it was, and if they were vampires, neither of them might awaken. At least, not in this world. The boy said, "I'll get some wood." The gunslinger smiled. "No, you won't. Sit yourself down, Jake." Whose phrase had that been? Some woman. The boy sat. When the gunslinger got back, Jake was asleep in the grass. A large praying mantis was performing ablutions on the spraying stem of Jack's cowlick. The gunslinger set the fire and went after water. The willow jungle was deeper than he had suspected and confusing in the failing light, but he found a spring richly guarded by frogs and peepers. He filled one of their water skins and paused. The sounds that filled the night awoke an uneasy sensuality in him, a feeling that not even Allie, the woman he had bedded in tall, had been able to bring to the fore. Sensuality and fucking are, after all, cousins of the most tenuous relation. He chalked it up to the sudden blinding change from the desert. The softness of the dark seemed nearly decadent. He returned to the camp and skinned the rabbit, while water boiled over the fire. Mixed with the last of their canned food, the rabbit made an excellent stew. He woke Jake and watched him as he ate, bleary but ravenous. "We stay here tomorrow," the gunslinger said. "But that man you're after, the priest." "He's no priest, and don't worry, we've got him." "How do you know that?" The gunslinger could only shake his head. The knowledge was strong in him, but it was not a good knowledge. After the meal, he rinsed the cans they had eaten from, marveling again at his own water extravagance. And when he turned around, Jake was asleep again. The gunslinger felt the now familiar rising and falling in his chest that could only identify with Cuthbert. Cuthbert had been Roland's own age, but he had seemed so much younger. His cigarette drooped toward the grass, and he tossed it into the fire. He looked at it, the clear, yellow burn, so different, so much cleaner from the way the devil grass burned. The air was wonderfully cool, and he lay down with his back to the fire. Far away, through the gash that led the way into the mountains, he heard the thick mouth of the perpetual thunder. He slept and dreamed. Susan, his beloved, was dying before his eyes. He watched, his arms held by two villagers on each side, his neck dog caught in a huge rusty iron collar. She was dying. Even through the thick stench of the fire, Roland could smell the darkness of the pit, and he could see the color of his own madness. Susan, lovely girl at the window, horse drover's daughter. She was turning black in the flames, her skin cracking open. "The boy!" she was screaming. "Roland, the boy!" He whirled, pulling his captors with him. The collar ripped at his neck, and he heard the hitching, strangling sounds that were coming from his own throat. There was a sickish, sweet smell of barbecuing meat on the air. The boy was looking down at him from a huge window high above the courtyard, the same window where Susan, who had taught him to be a man, had once sat and sung the old songs. "Hey Jude," and "Ease on down the road," and "100 Leagues to Banbury Cross." He looked out from the window, like the statue of an alabaster saint in a cathedral. His eyes were marble. A spike had been driven through Jake's forehead. The gunslinger felt the strange, ripping scream that signaled the beginning of his lunacy pull up from the root of his belly. Roland grunted a cry as he felt the fire singe him. He sat bolt upright in the dark, still feeling the dream around him, strangling him like the collar he had worn. In his twistings and turnings, he had thrown one hand against the dying coals of the fire. He put the hand to his face, feeling the dream flee, leaving only the stark picture of Jake, plaster white, a saint for demons. He glared around at the mystic darkness of the willow grove, both guns out and ready. His eyes were red loopholes in the last glow from the fire. Jake! The gunslinger was up and on the run. A bitter circle of moon had risen, and he could follow the boy's track in the dew. He ducked under the first of the willows, splashed through the spring, and legged up the far bank, skidding in the dampness. Even now his body could relish it. Willows slapped him in the face. The trees were thicker here, and the moon was blotted out. Tree trunks rose in lurching shadows. The grass, now knee-high, slapped against him. Half-rotted dead branches reached for his shins, his cojones. He paused for a moment, lifting his head and scenting at the air. A ghost of a breeze helped him. The boy did not smell good, of course. Neither of them did. The gunslinger's nostrils flared like those of an ape. The odor of sweat was faintly, oily, unmistakable. He crashed over a deadfall of grass and bramble and down branches, sprinted down a tunnel of overhanging willow and sumac. Moss struck his shoulders, some clung in shining gray tendrils. He clawed through a last barricade of willows and came to a clearing that looked up at the stars and the highest peak of the range, gleaming skull white at an impossible altitude. There was a ring of tall black stones which looked like some sort of surreal animal trap in the moonlight. In the center was a table of stone, an altar. Very old, rising out of the ground on a powerful arm of basalt. The boy stood beside it, trembling back and forth. His hands shook at his sides as if infused with static electricity. The gunslinger called his name sharply, and Jake responded with that inarticulate sound of negation. The faint smear of face, almost hidden by the boy's left shoulder, looked both terrified and exalted. And there was something else. The gunslinger stepped inside the ring, and Jake screamed, recoiling and throwing up his arms. Now his face could be seen clearly and indexed. The gunslinger saw fear and terror, warring with an almost excruciating grimace of pleasure. The gunslinger felt touched him. The spirit of the oracle, the succubus. His loins were suddenly filled with rose light, a light that was soft yet hard. He felt his head twisting, his tongue thickening, and becoming excruciatingly sensitive to even the spittle that coated it. He did not think when he pulled the half-rotten jawbone from the pocket where he'd carried it since he found it in the lair of the speaking demon at the way station. He did not think, but it did not frighten him to operate on pure instinct. He held the jawbone's frozen, prehistoric grin up in front of him, holding his other arm out stiffly, first and last fingers poked out in the ancient forked talisman, the ward against the evil eye. The current of sensuality was whipped away from him like a drape. Jake screamed again. The gunslinger walked to him. He held the jawbone in front of Jake's warring eyes, a wet sound of agony. The boy tried to pull his gaze away, could not, and suddenly both eyes rolled up to show the whites. Jake collapsed. His body struck the earth limply, one hand almost touching the altar. The gunslinger dropped to one knee and picked him up. He was amazingly light, as dehydrated as a November leaf from their long walk through the desert. Around him, Roland could feel the presence that dwelt in the circle of stones, whirring with a jealous anger. Its prize had been taken from it. When the gunslinger passed out of the circle, the sense of frustrated jealousy faded. He carried Jake back to their camp. By the time they got there, the boy's twitching unconsciousness had become deep sleep. The gunslinger paused for a moment, above the gray ruin of the fire. The moonlight on Jake's face reminded him again of a church saint, alabaster purity, all unknown. He suddenly hugged the boy, knowing that he loved him. And it seemed that he could almost feel the laughter from the man in black someplace far above them. Jake was calling him. That's how he awoke. He had tied the boy firmly to one of the tough bushes that grew nearby, and the boy was hungry and upset. By the sun, it was almost 9:30. "Why'd you tie me up?" Jake asked indignantly, as the gunslinger loosened the thick knots in the blanket. "I wasn't going to run away." "You did run away," the gunslinger said, and the expression on Jake's face made him smile. "I had to go out and get you. You were sleepwalking." "I was?" Jake looked at him suspiciously. The gunslinger nodded and suddenly produced the jawbone. He held it in front of Jake's face, and Jake flinched away from it, raising his arm. "See?" Jake nodded, bewildered. "I have to go off for a while now. I may be gone the whole day, so listen to me, boy. It's important. If sunset comes and I'm not back..." Fear flashed on Jake's face. "You're leaving me?" The gunslinger only looked at him. "No," Jake said after a moment. "I guess you're not." "I want you to stay right here while I'm gone. And if you feel strange, funny in any way, you pick up this bone and hold it in your hands." Hate and disgust crossed Jake's face, mixed with bewilderment. I couldn't. I just couldn't." "You can. You may have to. Especially after midday. It's important. Dig?" "Why do you have to go away?" Jake burst out. "I just do." The gunslinger caught another fascinating glimpse of the steel that lay under the boy's surface, as enigmatic as the story he had told about coming from a city where the buildings were so tall they actually scraped the sky. "All right," Jake said. The gunslinger laid the jawbone carefully on the ground next to the ruins of the fire, where it grinned up through the grass like some eroded fossil that has seen the light of day after a night of 5,000 years. Jake would not look at it. His face was pale and miserable. The gunslinger wondered if it would profit them for him to put the boy to sleep and question him, but he decided there would be little to gain. He knew well enough that the spirit of the stone circle was surely a demon, and a very likely an oracle as well. A demon with no shape, only a kind of unformed sexual glare with the eye of prophecy. He wondered sardonically if it might not be the soul of Sylvia Pittston, the giant woman whose religious huckstering had led to the final showdown in Tall, but knew it was not. The The stones in the circle had been ancient. This particular demon's territory staked out long before the earliest shade of prehistory. But the gunslinger knew the forms of speaking quite well and did not think the boy would have to use the jawbone mojo. The voice and mind of the oracle would be more than occupied with him, and the gunslinger needed to know things, in spite of the risk, and the risk was high, for both Jake and himself. He needed, desperately, to know. The gunslinger opened his tobacco poke and pawed through it, pushing the dry strands of leaf aside until he came to a minuscule object wrapped in a fragment of white paper. He hefted it in his hand, looking absently up at the sky. Then he unwrapped it and held the contents, a tiny white pill with edges that had been much worn with traveling, in his hand. Jake looked at it curiously. "What's that?" The gunslinger uttered a short laugh. "The philosopher's stone," he said. "The story that Court used to tell us was that the old gods pissed over the desert and made mescaline." Jake only looked puzzled. "A drug," the gunslinger said, "but not one that puts you to sleep. One that wakes you up all the way for a little while." "Like LSD?" the boy agreed instantly, and then looked puzzled. "What's that?" "I don't know," Jake said. "It just popped out. I think it came from, before." The gunslinger nodded, but he was doubtful. He had never heard of mescaline referred to as LSD, not even in Martin's old books. "Will it hurt you?" Jake asked. "It never has," the gunslinger said, conscious of the evasion. "I don't like it." "Never mind." The gunslinger squatted in front of the water skin and took a mouthful and swallowed the pill. As always, he felt an immediate reaction in his mouth. It seemed overloaded with saliva. He sat down before the dead fire. "When does something happen to you?" Jake asked. "Not for a little while. Be quiet." So Jake was quiet, watching with open suspicion as the gunslinger went calmly about the ritual of cleaning his guns. He reholstered them and said, "Your shirt, Jake. Take it off and give it to me." Jake pulled his faded shirt reluctantly over his head and gave it to the gunslinger. The gunslinger produced a needle that had been threaded into the side seam of his jeans and thread from an empty cartridge loop in his gun belt, and began to sew up a long rip in one of the sleeves of the boy's shirt. He finished and handed the shirt back. He felt the mesk begin to take hold. There was a tightening in his stomach and a feeling that all the muscles in his body were being cranked up a notch. "I have to go," he said, getting up. The boy half rose, his face a shadow of concern, and then settled back. "Be careful," he said. "Please." "Remember the jawbone," the gunslinger said. He put his hand on Jake's head as he went by and tousled the corn-colored hair. The gesture startled him into a short laugh. Jake watched after him with a troubled smile until he was gone into the willow jungle. The gunslinger walked deliberately toward the circle of stones, pausing once to get a cool drink from the spring. He could see his own reflection in a tiny pool edged with moss and lily pads, and he looked at himself for a moment, as fascinated as Narcissus. The mind reaction was beginning to settle in, slowing down his chain of thought by seeming to increase the connotations of every idea and every bit of sensory input. Things began to take on weight and thickness that had been heretofore invisible. He paused, getting to his feet again, and looked through the tangled snarl of willows. Sunlight slanted through it in a golden, dusty bar, and he watched the interplay of motes and tiny flying things for a moment before going on. The drug often had disturbed him. His ego was too strong, or perhaps just too simple, to enjoy being eclipsed and peeled back, made a target for some sensitive emotions. They tickled in him like a cat's whiskers, but this time he felt fairly calm. That was good. He stepped into the clearing and walked straight into the circle. He stood, letting his mind run free. Yes, It was coming harder now, faster. The grass screamed green at him. It seemed that if he bent over and rubbed his hands in it, he would stand up with green paint all over his fingers and palms. He resisted a puckish urge to try the experiment. But there was no voice from the oracle, no sexual stirring. He went to the altar, stood beside it for a moment. Coherent thought was now almost impossible. His teeth felt strange in his head. The world held too much light. He climbed up on the altar and lay back. His mind was becoming a jungle full of strange thought plants that he had never seen or suspected before. A willow jungle that had grown up around a mescaline spring. The sky was water, and he hung suspended over it. The thought gave him a vertigo that seemed far away and unimportant. A line of old poetry occurred to him. Not a nursery verse now, no. His mother had feared the drugs and the necessity of them, as she had feared court and the necessity for this beater of boys. This verse came from one of the deans to the north of the desert, where men still lived among the machines that usually didn't work, and which sometimes ate the men when they did. The lines played again and again, reminding him, in an unconnected way that was typical of the mescaline rush, of snow falling in a globe he'd owned as a child, mystic and half-fantastical. Beyond the reach of human range, a drop of hell, a touch of strange. The trees which overhung the altar contained faces. He watched them with abstract fascination. Here was a dragon, green and twitching. Here a wood nymph with beckoning branch arms. Here a living skull overgrown with slime. Faces. Faces. The grasses of the clearing suddenly whipped and bent. I come. I come. Vague stirrings within his flesh. How far I have come, he thought, from couching with Susan in sweet hay to this. She pressed over him, a body made of the wind, a breast of sudden fragrant jasmine, rose, and honeysuckle. Make your prophecy, he said. His mouth felt full of metal. A sigh, a faint sound of weeping. The gunslinger's genitals felt drawn and hard. Over him and beyond the faces and the leaves, he could see the mountains, hard and brutal and full of teeth. The body moved against him, struggled with him. He felt his hands curl into fists. She had sent him a vision of Susan. It was Susan above him, lovely Susan at the window, waiting for him with her hair spilled down her back and over her shoulders. He tossed his head, but her face followed. Jasmine, rose, honeysuckle, old hay, the smell of love. Love me. Speak prophecy, he said. Please, the oracle wept. Don't be cold. It is always so cold here. Hands slipping over his flesh, manipulating, lighting him on fire, pulling him, drawing. A black crevice, the ultimate wanton, wet and warm. No, dry, cold, sterile. Have a touch of mercy, Gunslinger. Ah, please, I beg your favor. Mercy. Would you have mercy on the boy? What boy? I know no boy. It's not boys I need. Oh, please. Jasmine, rose, honeysuckle, dry hay with its ghost of summer clover, oil decanted from ancient urns, a riot for flesh. After, he said. Now, please, now. He let his mind coil out at her, the antithesis of emotion. The body that hung over him froze and seemed to scream. There was a brief, vicious tug-of-war between his temples. His mind was the rope gray and fibrous. For long moments there was no sound but the quiet hush of his breathing and the faint breeze which made the green faces in the trees shift, wink, and grimace. No birds sang. Her hold loosened. Again there was the sound of sobbing. It would have to be quick, or she would leave him. To stay now meant attenuation, perhaps her own kind of death. Already he felt her drawing away to leave the circle of stones. Wind rippled the grass in tortured patterns. Prophecy, he said, a bleak noun. A weeping, tired sigh. He could almost have granted the mercy she begged, but there was Jake. He would have found Jake dead or insane if he had been any later last night. Sleep, then. No. Then half sleep. The gunslinger turned his eyes up to the faces in the leaves. A play was being enacted, there for his amusement. Worlds rose and fell before him. Empires were built across shining sands, where forever machines toiled in abstract electronic frenzies. Empires declined and fell. Wheels that had spun like silent liquid moved more slowly, began to squeak, began to scream, stopped. Sand choked the stainless steel gutters of concentric streets below dark skies, full of stars like beds of cold jewels. And through it all, a dying wind of change blew, bringing with it the cinnamon smell of late October. The gunslinger watched as the world moved on, and half slept. 3. This is the number of your fate. 3? Yes, 3 is mystic. 3 stands at the heart of the mantra. Which 3? We see in part, and thus is the mirror of prophecy darkened. Tell me what you can. The first is young, dark-haired. He stands on the brink of robbery and murder. A demon has infested him. The name of the demon is heroin. Which demon is that? I know it not, even from nursery stories. We see in part, and thus is the mirror of prophecy darkened. There are other worlds, gunslinger, and other demons. These waters are deep. The second, she comes on wheels. Her mind is iron, but her heart and eyes are soft. I see no more. The third, in chains. The man in black, where is he? Near, you will speak with him. Of what will we speak? The tower. The boy? Jake? Tell me of the boy. The boy is your gateway to the man in black. The man in black is your gate to the 3. The 3 are your way to the dark tower. How? How can that be? Why must it be? We see in part, and thus is the mirror. Doggone you! No God damned me. Don't patronize me, thing. I'm stronger than you. What do they call you then? Star slut? Whore of the winds? Some live on love that comes to the ancient places, even in these sad and evil times. Some, gunslinger, live on blood. Even I understand on the blood of young boys. May he not be spared? Yes. How? Cease, gunslinger. Strike your camp and turn west. In the west, there is still a need for men who live by the bullet. I am sworn by my father's guns and by the treachery of Martin. Martin is no more. The man in black has eaten his soul. This you know. I am sworn. Then you are damned. Have your way with me, bitch. Eagerness. The shadow swung over him, enfolded him. Suddenly, ecstasy, broken only by a galaxy of pain, as faint and bright as ancient stars gone red with collapse. Faces came to him unbidden at the climax of their coupling. Sylvia Pittston, Alice, the woman from Tall, Susan, Alen, 100 others, and finally, after an eternity, he pushed her away from him, once again in his right mind, bone-weary and disgusted. "No, it isn't enough. Let me be," the gunslinger said. He sat up and almost fell off the altar before regaining his feet. She touched him tentatively. "Honeysuckle, jasmine, sweet tartar," and he pushed her violently, falling to his knees. He staggered up and made his drunken way to the perimeter of the circle. He staggered through, feeling a huge weight fall from his shoulders. He drew a shuddering, weeping breath. As he started away, he could feel her standing at the bars of her prison, watching him grow from her. He wondered how long it might be before someone else crossed the desert and found her, hungry and alone. For a moment, he felt dwarfed by the possibilities of time. And that will conclude our rather long reading today of Jake and Roland's encounter with the Oracle of the Mountains. I hope you enjoyed this, the 10th installment of the Ogre's production of the Gunslinger Dark Tower series, Book 1 by Stephen King.